May 1945. The war is over. The good guys won. Or did they? While the world celebrated in the streets, the greatest mass murderers in history were quietly packing their bags. They didn't run into the woods to hide. They walked right through the front door of Europe. They were helped by the Vatican. They were protected by the CIA. And they were welcomed like heroes by a president in South America. How did the architect of the Holocaust become a factory worker in Buenos Aires? How did the angel of death retire to a beach in Brazil? And why did the people hunting them suddenly decide to look the other way? This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is the true story of the Ratlines. And it starts right now. It is May 1945. The guns have finally fallen silent. Berlin, once the beating heart of a would-be global empire, is now a graveyard concrete and steel. The 1,000-year Reich, which promised to rule the world for a millennium, has crumbled into dust and rubble in just 12 terrifying years. The streets are unrecognizable canyons of debris. The smell of smoke, cordite, and death hangs heavy in the spring air. Adolf Hitler is dead. His body burned in a shell crater outside his bunker. The war in Europe is over. The world is celebrating. In Times Square, London, Moscow, crowds are dancing in the streets. But amidst the champagne and the cheers, a different kind of operation is beginning in the shadows. The Allies, America, Britain, and the Soviets aren't just here to occupy. They are here to hunt. Special Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, teams and Soviet NKVD agents are prowling through the ruins. They are carrying lists, long lists of names. These aren't just soldiers. These are the monsters who orchestrated the industrial slaughter of millions. The Allies want justice. They want a reckoning. They want to drag the architects of the Holocaust before a tribunal and show the world the faces of pure evil. But as the smoke clears and the initial euphoria of victory fades, the Allied commanders realize something terrifying. Something that sends a chill down the spine of every intelligence officer on the ground. The bodies are missing. We aren't talking about low-level foot soldiers or anonymous guards who threw away their uniforms and blended into the flood of refugees. We are talking about the masterminds, the men whose signatures were on the deportation orders, the men who designed the gas chambers, the men who treated human beings like laboratory rats. Take Adolf Eichmann. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a logistics manager of the Holocaust. He was the man who made the trains run on time to the death camps. He was the architect of the final solution. Intelligence teams kicked down the door of his last known safe house, guns drawn, expecting a firefight or suicide. They find nothing, just a cold cup of coffee and an empty room. Take Josef Mengele, the angel of death, the man who stood on the ramp at Auschwitz, whistling opera while he sent children to the left to die and twins to the right for his horrific, sadistic experiments. The Allies are desperate to find him. They want him more than almost anyone else. But Mengele, too, is gone. One by one, the biggest names on the list turn up missing. Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, gone. Erich Priebke, the butcher of the Ardeatine caves, gone. Panic begins to set in among the Allied High Command. How is this possible? Europe is locked down. There are millions of Allied troops patrolling the roads. Checkpoints are set up at every major intersection. The borders are sealed. Every German male is being screened. How does a man whose face is on every most wanted poster in the world just walk away? How do thousands of SS officers, men with blood-type tattoos under their arms and recognizable scars, slip through a net tightened by the most powerful armies in human history? They didn't just vanish into thin air. They didn't burrow into the ground. The answer isn't a magic trick. It is a conspiracy so dark, so complex, and so cynical that it sounds like fiction. It involves the holiest corridors of the Vatican, where priests traded prayers for passports. It involves the secret, smoke-filled offices of American intelligence, where the enemy of yesterday became the asset of tomorrow. And it involves a populist president in South America who didn't just ignore these fugitives. He welcomed them with open arms. These men didn't escape because they were lucky. They escaped because a bridge was built for them. A bridge of spies, priests, and politicians. Welcome to the story of the Ratlines. This is how the devil escaped justice. To understand the sheer scale of this escape, we have to look at the map. The Nazis were trapped. To the east, the vengeful Soviet Red Army was closing in. To the west, the Americans and British controlled the skies and the ports. There was only one way out, south, over the mountains. They called it the Klosterlinie, the monastery route. It started in the Austrian Tyrol, a rugged landscape of snow-capped peaks and deep valleys. Defeated SS officers would shed their black uniforms, burn their ID papers in the forest, and don civilian clothes, sometimes even the robes of priests. They would trek over the Brenner Pass, a smuggling route used for centuries, and cross into Italy. Italy was chaos. It was a broken nation, teeming with millions of displaced people, refugees, and soldiers. In this sea of confusion, it was easy to disappear. But the Nazis didn't just wander aimlessly. They had a destination. They were heading for the eternal city, Rome. Why Rome? Because Rome offered something no other city could. The diplomatic immunity of the Vatican, and of the central figure of this conspiracy, Bishop Alois Hudal. Hudal wasn't just a rogue priest. He was a powerful figure. He was the rector of the Pontificio Istituto Teutonico Santa Maria dell'Anima, the German seminary in Rome. And he was an unrepentant anti-Semite and a staunch German nationalist. While the rest of the world looked at the SS and saw monsters, Hudal saw patriots. He believed that the Nuremberg trials were a sham, a Jewish revenge orchestrated by the Allies. But his motivation went even deeper. Hudal was terrified of the Soviet Union. He believed that the Christian West was about to be swallowed by godless communism. And in his twisted logic, these battle-hardened Nazis were the only warriors capable of fighting the coming war against Russia. He called his operation a golden bridge, a pathway to save the German elite from Allied justice. Here's how the scam worked. It was brilliant, bureaucratic, and terrifyingly simple. A fugitive Nazi, let's say Franz Stangl, the commander of the Treblinka extermination camp, would arrive in Rome. He would knock on the door of Hudal's seminary. He wouldn't be turned away. Instead, he would be given food, money, and a bed. Then came the paperwork. Hudal's office would issue a formal Vatican letter stating that this man was a refugee, a victim of the war, a stateless person with no papers. The name Franz Stangl would disappear. In its place, a new name was typed. A new history was invented, armed with his Vatican letter. The fugitive would walk to the offices of the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, in Rome. The Red Cross, overwhelmed by the humanitarian crisis of millions of refugees, didn't have the resources to investigate every applicant. They trusted the church. If a bishop vouched for a man, that was good enough. Based on Hudal's lie, the Red Cross would issue a valid travel document, a laissez-passer. This was the golden ticket. It wasn't a fake passport. It was a real document obtained under false pretenses. It gave these mass murderers legal status. Suddenly, the butcher Treblinka was just a mechanic named Paul. Adolf Eichmann, the man who organized the logistics of the Holocaust, became Ricardo Clement, a quiet technician, with their new identities and Red Cross passports in hand. They took the train to the port of Genoa. There, ships were waiting to take them to the other side of the world. As they walked up the gangplank, they weren't sneaking onto a cargo ship in the dead of night. They were boarding as legal passengers, often with tickets paid for by organizations like Caritas or secret Nazi funds. They watched the coast of Europe fade into the distance, carrying with them the secrets of the gas chambers, protected by the very institutions that were supposed to stand for humanity. After weeks at sea, crossing the vast, empty Atlantic, the ships finally spotted land. They weren't heading for a hidden cove or a jungle landing strip. They were sailing straight into the muddy, golden waters of the Rio de la Plata. They had arrived in the southern cone of South America, specifically Argentina. For these men, stepping off the boat in Buenos Aires must have felt like stepping onto another planet. Europe was a smoking ruin, starving and broken. But Argentina in the late 1940s was one of the richest countries in the world. The shops were full of meat and wine. The lights were blazing and the streets were safe. But most importantly, the political climate was warmer than the weather. At the helm of this nation stood President Juan Domingo Perón. Perón was a complex figure, a populist titan who charmed the working class but ruled with an iron fist. But beneath his local politics lay a deep personal fascination. Perón had served as a military attaché in Mussolini's Italy before the war. He had seen the rise of fascism up close, and he was impressed. He admired the discipline, the order, and the nationalistic fervor of the Axis powers. But his decision to import Nazis wasn't just about admiration. It was a cold, calculated geopolitical gamble. Perón was convinced that a third world war was inevitable. He believed that the fragile peace between the USA and the Soviet Union would shatter within a few years. In this coming apocalypse, Perón wanted Argentina to stand alone, neither capitalist nor communist, but as a powerful, independent third position. To build this superpower, he needed expertise. He needed the men who had built Hitler's V-2 rockets. He needed the pilots who had flown the world's first jet fighters. He needed the nuclear physicists who had almost given the Nazis the bomb. This wasn't an accident. It was government policy. Perón established a secret organization right inside the presidential palace, the Casa Rosada. It was called the Information Bureau for Immigration, run by Rodolfo Freude, a German Argentine whose father was a close friend of Perón and a suspected Nazi financier. Freude's office was the reception desk for the Third Reich. They sent agents to Europe to handpick useful fugitives. They issued thousands of landing permits, blank checks that allowed anyone, regardless of their past crimes, to enter Argentina legally. So, when the ships docked, the mechanics and technicians didn't have to sneak past customs. They were waved through. It was a golden ticket. When men like Adolf Eichmann arrived, they didn't have to live in caves or change their faces. They simply melted into the massive German community that already existed in Argentina. Eichmann, under the name Ricardo Clement, didn't live like a fugitive on the run. He lived like a bored, middle-class suburban dad. He built a small brick house in a poor neighborhood of Buenos Aires. He took the bus to work every morning at a Mercedes-Benz factory, where the foreman and many of the workers were also former SS men. They knew who he was. They called him Herr Eichmann when no one was looking. Josef Mengele, the angel of death, lived even more openly. He wasn't hiding in the jungle. He was networking in high society. He started a pharmaceutical business. He sold farm equipment. He even had his name listed in the Buenos Aires telephone directory. They found sanctuary in places like Bariloche, a town in the Andes that looked so much like the Bavarian Alps that it made them feel at home. They built chalets, opened chocolatiers, and held festivals. For over a decade, Argentina wasn't just a hiding place. It was a cape of last hope, a surreal twilight zone where the Third Reich lived on, protected by silence, money, and the president himself. Now, we have to ask a question that makes history books uncomfortable. Where was the rest of the world? Where was the United States? Where was the CIA? For decades, the narrative was simple. We were the good guys. We were hunting the bad guys. But when the files were finally declassified in the 2000s, a much darker, murkier truth emerged. By 1946, the geopolitical chessboard had flipped completely. The war against Hitler was yesterday's news. A new, terrifying reality had set in: the Cold War. The American government was no longer worried about the swastika. They were terrified of the hammer and sickle. The enemy was now Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union. In the panicked meeting rooms of Washington, D.C., a dangerous logic took hold. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, even if that friend is a monster. This started with the famous Operation Paperclip. The U.S. government secretly recruited over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians. Men like Werner von Braun, who had used slave labor to build V-2 rockets that killed civilians in London, were brought to America to build a Saturn V rocket that would take man to the moon. Their pasts were sanitized. Their files were scrubbed. Science, it seemed, was more important than justice. But it didn't stop at scientists. It went much, much darker. The U.S. Army's Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, the precursor to the modern CIA, began to recruit former SS officers and Gestapo agents. Why? Because these men were experts on Russia. They had spent years fighting the Soviets on the Eastern Front. They had networks of spies in Eastern Europe. The Americans were desperate for intel on the Red Army, and they decided that these Nazis were the only ones who could provide it. Take the case of Klaus Barbie. History knows him as a butcher of lion. In France, he tortured members of the resistance, murdered children, and sent thousands to their deaths. He was a sadist. But after the war, the Americans didn't arrest him. They hired him. The CIC paid Klaus Barbie a salary. They gave him an apartment. They used him to spy on French communists. And when the French government, an American ally, asked for Barbie to be extradited to stand trial for crimes against humanity, the Americans lied. They said they didn't know where he was. In reality, they were protecting him. And when the heat got too hot, the Americans didn't just let him go. They used the Ratlines themselves. The U.S. intelligence services helped smuggle Klaus Barbie out of Europe and into Bolivia, where he lived for decades, helping military dictatorships torture political opponents. This was the blind eye policy. The intelligence agencies were so terrified of the Red Scare, the spread of communism in Latin America, that they saw these fugitive Nazis as potential assets. A former SS officer in Argentina or Bolivia was seen as a staunch anti-communist, a useful idiot who could be used to suppress left-wing uprisings. So, while the public was told that the hunt for Nazis was ongoing, in the shadows, the hunters were often shaking hands with the prey. They allowed the Ratlines to operate not out of incompetence, but out of strategy. They prioritized a future war against Russia over the justice of the past war against Germany. It was a deal with the devil, signed in invisible ink, and the price was justice for millions of victims. But you cannot hide from history forever. While governments played politics, the victims did not forget. While the superpowers were distracted by the Cold War, the survivors of the Holocaust were haunted by the lack of justice. The Jewish people, and specifically the young state of Israel and its intelligence agency, Mossad, were not willing to let the timeline fade. They began a relentless, decades-long hunt. The breakthrough didn't come from a satellite or a spy. It came from a blind man. Lothar Hermann was a Jewish refugee living in Argentina. He was blind, but he saw what others missed. His daughter had started dating a young man named Nick. Nick bragged about his father's past, about his importance in the war. Nick's last name was Eichmann. Hermann put the pieces together and sent a message to Germany, which eventually reached the Mossad. The message was simple and electric. The devil is living in Buenos Aires. It was May 1960. Mossad launched Operation Finale. A team of elite agents flew into Argentina on fake passports. They tracked Eichmann to a rundown house on Garibaldi Street. They watched him. They learned his routine. They realized that the architect of the Holocaust was now just a bald, bespectacled man who took the same bus home every night at 7:40 p.m. On May 11th, the trap was set. The agents waited in a car, their hearts pounding in their chests. The bus arrived. Eichmann got off. Agent Peter Malkin approached him. He didn't scream. He simply said, "Momentito, senor, one moment, sir." Then he tackled him. In seconds, Eichmann was dragged into the car. There was no shootout, just a muffled sound of a struggle, and the car speeding away into the Argentine night. They took him to a safe house, where they interrogated him for days. Finally, the man who had sent millions to their deaths admitted his identity. "It's been Adolf Eichmann," he whispered. Getting him out was the final hurdle. They drugged him, dressed him in an El Al flight attendant's uniform, and walked him right past Argentine customs, claiming he was a sick crew member. The plane took off, carrying the ghost of the Third Reich back to the people he tried to exterminate. When the news broke, the world was stunned. Eichmann was put on trial in Jerusalem. He sat in a bulletproof glass booth, listening to the testimony of survivors. For the first time, the world truly heard the horrors of the Holocaust on live television. The banality of evil was exposed. He wasn't a screaming demon, but a small, pathetic bureaucrat who claimed he was just following orders. In 1962, Adolf Eichmann was hanged. It was the only time Israel has ever enacted the death penalty. The message was clear: you are never safe. The capture of Eichmann sent a shock wave through the Nazi underground. Josef Mengele, terrified that he was next, fled to Paraguay and then Brazil. He lived the rest of his life in paranoia. looking over his shoulder, eventually drowning in a swimming pool in 1979, never facing a judge. But the exposure of the Ratlines changed history. It forced the world to look in the mirror. Decades later, the Vatican would apologize for its role. The CIA would be forced to declassify its files, revealing the dark compromises of the Cold War. Evil doesn't just disappear. It hides in the bureaucracy, in the silence, and in the political conveniences of the powerful. It waits for us to forget. What do you think? Was the capture of Eichmann justice served? Or should the others have been caught too? Was it political necessity or a moral failure that allowed so many to escape? Let me know in the comments below. This is a dark chapter, but one we must remember. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon. See you in the next investigation.